West Africa to the Bahamas. And I try to extrapolate from the history, from the general histories, Saunders, Creighton, etc., and some other more specific databases that have become available, the social conditions in 3 periods. I want to look at, first off, what I'm referring to as the comp period, all right? You're going to ask me about that choice of that afterwards, which is between 1718 and 1783. I'm looking at 2 migrations, 2 loyalist migrations in 1783 to 1809. One of them well documented by Creighton and Saunders, and the other one actually that is not so well documented. And finally, the 4th migration I want to consider is that of the liberated Africans between 1811 to 1860. All right, looking at the map that is up there right now, I just want to point out that the early settlement of Hog Island, Eleuthera, and New Providence, and the way in which it was settled and the migrations of people that arrived on these 3 islands in the pre-loyalist period had consequences and created a linguistic landscape where the northern islands and the language spoken in the northern islands would have been quite distinct to the language that emerged in the central and the southern islands. All right, so if I can move to early settlement. So in the 1700s, during the decades before the arrival of the Loyalists, New Providence, Eleuthera, and Hog Island were the only inhabited islands. The early settlers were seafaring men who engaged in a range of maritime pursuits, including turtling, fishing, trading, wrecking, privateering, and of course the search for ambergris. For these coasting activities, slaves made up the crews on the Bahamian sloops. Other activities such as the seasonal salt raking and cutting native woods from various islands required sloops and also required gangs of laborers. The settlers were also engaged in boat building, and throughout the 1700s, home-built sloops of Bahamian cedar and mahogany grew in size and number. By 1731, the local fleet comprised 14 sloops between 8 to 50 tons belonging to the port and used for export. Export primarily to the Carolinas or the US colonies or the American colonies at the time, and export to the Caribbean islands, especially the ones that had been settled by the British. But we also have these amazing trips that we read, these trading trips that we read about by a former pirate, John Cockram, who actually was trading way down to Curacao, taking Bahamian-built Bermudian sloops down to Curacao. So, I mean, there was a lot of trading going on at the time. By 1748, the local trading fleet had jumped to 52 vessels. To build this fleet required a range of specialized laborers such as sawyers, joiners, caulkers, blacksmiths, and shipwrights. So it's clear that the maritime economy still required laborers, which were supplied initially by slaves from Africa. I want to look at the social conditions of the town of Nassau at this point. Painted very clearly by Dr. Saunders. The town of Nassau is a struggling settlement with a slow growth of population, which you will see by a chart that I put up in a while. The houses of the main settlers lined Bay Street, and housing for whites and blacks was intermixed throughout Nassau. Some slaves either living within or behind the larger homes of their owners, and free blacks residing within the town. That is from Dr. Saunders. In outlying areas to the east and west of Nassau town were subsistence farms, the majority of which had units of 10 plus slaves, and 2 of which were medium plantations, our first evidence of plantations, of 49 and 36 slaves belonging to Governor Rogers and his son. Prior to the Loyalists, this is the only evidence of gangs of laborers employed on a plantation. And then to the west of the town is this village that is called New Guinea, or the Creek, it is sometimes named, which was inhabited by free blacks or mulattoes. So these are social conditions which are critical to the interpretation or to providing insight into what was happening as far as the language is concerned. So early settlement for the Bahamas shows primarily a living and working environment which is not segregated for the English Bermudian settlers and the enslaved people of African heritage. Creighton, in his 1986 history, identifies 4 classes of slaves in order of importance. He lists the mariner slave as number 1, the domestic, number 2, the subsistence farming, and then the plantation slaves because of the few number of plantations. So for all intents and purposes, the mariner slaves enjoyed a degree of freedom and took in a percentage of fishing and turtling profits and were treated almost exactly as an ordinary white seaman. This is according to Creighton. The domestics lived with or close to their owners, and the services required of them were not arduous. The small farm slaves supplying Nassau with vegetable, fruit, and poultry were almost on an equal footing with their masters. The few plantation estates would be as labor-intensive as some of the smaller plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and Carolina. I have a regional comparison. It was a lot more complicated at one point, but I want to show you, like, in early settlement and up to emancipation, exactly, you know, what the numbers of slaves looked like in the, I mean, obviously Jamaica had a very, very established, rigorous monoplantation. So, I mean, look at those numbers. By 1834, the Jamaican slave population is larger than our present total population, you know, in contrast to the Bahamas, where we have actually 10,000 slaves. That in itself is excellent evidence of what the difference is between a plantation economy and a maritime economy. And when we look at stats like this, you know, we need to look at, I mean, it's a lot more complicated than this because we need to look at differences in the growth rates of the populations. We need to look at the point at which the African population surpassed the English, the rates and peaks of slave imports, which again are extremely, extremely different. I mean, there are some points at which Jamaica imported like 10,000 slaves in 1 year, you know, because of the mortality rates, etc. But all of these help to explain the differences in the evolving language systems. And, you know, we need to look at, you know, the linguistic landscape across the Caribbean as being very, very different because of the different points of contact. Since the slave population in the Bahamas was not demographically healthy enough to sustain itself by natural increase in the early settlement, that is the Comte period, the slaves were imported to the Bahamas directly from Africa, indirectly from other Caribbean colonies, or Charleston, South Carolina, or they were off Spanish and French prizes captured by Bahamian privateers during the 1740 and 50 wars. So let me give you a look at some of these stats a little bit closer. First off, I mean, this is interesting just as a byway because our early records show that this landing, this migration of 295 Bozal slaves to the Bahamas in 1721 are from the Guinea coast. Well, that's not very helpful linguistically because the Guinea coast is huge, all right? So it would be in a periodical such as the London Journal, which tells us that the captain on that boat was actually collecting slaves at a place called 3 Points on the Guinea coast. And that is good because it helps us actually identify that migration in 1721, which I think is the earliest migration from the Gold Coast, all right? And this is not really surprising because of the British trading trends during the period. If we look at, let me go to, this is the total direct imports that I can find, and it's good from a linguistic point of view. Because why? Because, well, there is one unknown, but the ones that we know about are all from the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana. And the languages that they speak are two, that is Fante and Twi.